This year might not have the high-end wide receiver talent that we'd like to see, but that doesn't mean that you can't strike gold late in your rookie drafts. This is a deep wide receiver class, and Jeff Bell and we are going to go through pick by pick, drafting guys that we like in the order that we like them. Jeff Bell, you are on the clock. Who is the first wide receiver that you are taking of the 2025 rookie class?
Before the draft, go as safe as possible. Tetaroa, McMillan, it looks like right now it would be a little bit of maybe a major upset if he's not the first receiver off the board.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I mean, he is the consensus wide receiver one. And again, I let off the show talking about kind of some of the not the best high end talent. There's definitely some flaws in his game. And I've seen him anywhere from, a top 5 pick to outside of the top 20. We'll see on draft day. But he is absolutely the wide receiver one in this class. Since you got the first pick, Jeff, what we're going to do is 2 picks for the rest of this just to even it out a little bit. So with me being on the clock after you took Tetaroa McMillan, I'm going to go kind of chalky here. No surprise. Luther Burden is the next guy that I'm going to take, and Emeka Egbuka. These guys are both very similar players who like to play primarily out of the slot, dynamic playmakers, big athletes. I think Luther Burden, there are some concerns there, but I think that if everything pans out for all of these players, every player hits their high-end range of outcomes, Luther Burden's ceiling is not just, a fantasy wide receiver one. It's being one of the best receivers in football with that level of athleticism and size and playmaking ability. So he's the easy 2. Egbuka is the easy 3 for me. And we're going back to you, Jeff. Wide receiver 4 and 5. Who are you taking?
Real quick on those 2 players. It's almost like just how we have Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr., how it's different ways that you can get the ball to Malik Neighbors relative to Marvin Harrison Jr. And I think that you could see that play out with Burden versus McMillan. I'm going to go Travis Hunter. I think it's impossible to ignore Travis Hunter, even with the concerns that he might be a primary cornerback. He can still get 8 to 10 targets a game being a primary cornerback. And Matthew Golden from Texas, the wide receiver from Texas, is going to be my other pick. I think that's a player that you're commonly seeing him grouped with Emeka Egbuka. I think there's a great chance Matthew Golden cracks that first round. So I'm not going to walk away without Travis Hunter, Matthew Golden. And I do think that there is a little bit of a teardrop after those 2 players.
I understand that. I think that's a lot of people have it. I'm a big Trey Harris fan, so I don't see much of a teardrop here. I have Trey Harris actually ahead of Matthew Golden and Travis Hunter, and he's another one of those guys that, like we said, all of these guys do have some warts in their game, and Trey Harris, he doesn't have the game-breaking athleticism you'd like to see, and I think that lack of athleticism could push him down into potentially round 2 or 3. But you look at the production in college. This guy had over 5 yards per route run. He can was a little bit limited what they asked him to do at Ole Miss, but the more I watch, the more I like. And then Jalen Royals is the other guy that I'm going to take here. I don't want to talk about him too much. Jeff, we talked about him at length on the show that we did earlier in the week where we were talking about guys to watch at the combine. Really excited to see what Jalen Royals is able to do this week. Hopefully he doesn't have a terrible week and make this pick look awful. Back over to you, Jeff. Who are you taking here?
Jaden Higgins, I think, has to be the next player off the board. That's another player. I think he's in a similar tier with Trey Harris, with Jalen Royals there. And then Alec Aomenor, I think, is right there too. There's a lot of questions about him, but the upside is very, very high with Aomenor. I think he's a player that can be, especially with the combine coming up, that's an opportunity that he could maybe even enter that first round conversation.
Now, I see a lot of similarities when I look at Ted McMillan, Trey Harris, and Alec Aomenor. All of these guys are big, good possession receivers that all lack some of that elite upside here. So, Jeff, I don't want to totally put you on the spot here, but why is it you think Aomenor is the guy that is just consistently a little bit further in consensus rankings than these other big-bodied possession receivers?
I think his game translates a little bit better to being able to play in the slot, to be able to get a little bit more volume. I think he's a little bit more creative after the catch than some of these other players. And I think that when you look at a Jaden Higgins or a Trey Harris to some extent, you expect them to be a little bit more locked into the outside. Whereas I think the ceiling outcome for Aomenor would be a player that can work the slot, can move through formation, can handle a lot of volume.
All right. Agree with you there. Now, these next 2 guys that I draft at what is our wide receiver 10 and wide receiver 11, and I want to say these aren't our exact rankings either. There was a little bit of, gamesmanship here as Jeff and I were drafting these players. I wanted to get players before he could get them and vice versa. But I was really excited with these two. Xavier Restrepo and Jack Besh are two guys that I have just kind of fallen in love with so far throughout this draft process. Two very different players. Restrepo is built like a running back, played primarily out of the slot at Miami, but a really fun guy that should be a target hog at the next level. And then Jack Besh is a guy that Alfredo Brown comped to Puka Nacua, and I kind of hate him for making that comp because when I watch Jack Besh now, that's all I can see. A guy with very little wasted movements, a guy that gets downfield quickly, really likes contact, and is just another guy that, like Restrepo, I think is going to be a target hog at the NFL.
If you're the type of person that believes the Chiefs are winning football games because of Taylor Swift, Jack Besh, I think, is a good place to make a bet on. I think that we're all cheering for him after what happened with his brother in New Orleans, and we see with the Senior Bowl and kind of that walk off there. I think we're all in the corner for Jack Besh to be able to break out and be a star receiver.
Jeff, back over to you, wide receiver 12 and 13, and you got the Texas duo with this pick. Well, you took Matthew Golden earlier, and now
yes.
you're
Okay.
yeah.
I see where you're going now, because I was going to say
Sorry. Call back to earlier in the show.
Yes, Isaiah Bond is the next pick here, and it's just so difficult to place Isaiah Bond because I think that there were people had him locked into their top 5 receiver a month ago, and then we just have started to hear a little bit more, and I think that there are some concerns around his game, around his profile, and then Ty Felton is a player that coming out of Maryland. Another one of these guys, I think he has the opportunity to light it on fire on the combine and really become a major riser coming out of the combine. So he's kind of a little bit off the radar relative to where I think he's going to end up.
Now, let me just ask you, Jeff, again, putting you on the spot because that's apparently what I'm doing on today's show. When I see, and I thought it was funny, we have different people in our rookie guide that are doing these scouting reports. And I don't know if you caught this or not, but somebody did a scouting report for Matthew Golden. Somebody did a scouting report for Isaiah Bond. And both of the people who wrote that, two separate people, both came to the conclusion that the player comps for both of those players were Brandon Cooks. So I see two very similar players. Obviously, the scouts that we have on staff see two very similar players as well. What is it that makes you put Matthew Golden so high ahead of Isaiah Bond? Because I watch them and I could see a world very similar to last year. The two guys that came out of Texas with Adonai Mitchell and Xavier Worthy, two very talented receivers. I don't know who's going to go first in the draft.
I believe in Golden's ability to win downfield a little bit better too. So maybe you're thinking of like the downfield Brandon Cooks versus maybe like the short, quick passing game type Brandon Cooks. Like I think Isaiah Bond maybe lends it to that a little bit more. I was not on QC on those two players, and I'll just say that.
All right, back over to me, wide receiver 14 and wide receiver 15. And I will fully admit that this first pick that I'm making here comes from my heart a little bit as somebody who lived in Fort Collins for almost 5 years. Torrey Horton was a guy that the CSU kids just loved. And as I lived in Fort Collins and watched a lot of CSU games, I started to really like Torrey Horton as well. A guy who's definitely sliding under the radar a little bit during this draft process right here. But you look at him and you watch him play. I mean, he's got a catch radius the size of a barn door, just a really good polished receiver who can also contribute on special teams. Really excited to see his landing spot and where he lands. We are at the point in the draft, Jeff, though, where all of these guys are getting a little bit shaky. Potentially day 3 picks here, a good combine performance or some good news could potentially push them up to day 2. But the other guy after Torrey Horton that I'm going to take here is Jalen Noel. A guy that I think, has a pretty high ceiling here. He was kind of the number 2 at Iowa State. But when you watch him after the catch, I like that Golden Tate quality, and I see a little bit of that in his game. So pretty happy with these two picks, Torrey Horton and Jalen Noel. Over to you for wide receiver 16 and wide receiver 17, Jeff.
Yeah, Noel is a player that I probably would have loved to grab, and I think so. Full behind the curtain, peel back the curtain a little bit. We ran this on Sleeper, and for some reason, Jalen Noel is not in Sleeper. So Sleeper,
He's
when you're
not.
watching this, Jalen Noel should be in Sleeper, but I think maybe I thought I could slide something past Dave here and grab Noel a little bit around later than what I actually could, and so that was a good pick there. One of my absolute favorites, one of my draft darlings, Kyle Williams out of Washington State. I think is a player that I think the athleticism is going to be there. He was a big performer at the Senior Bowl. Natural separation, the ability to handle volume, I think, in an NFL offense. And then Tez Johnson. I think it's just really hard to ignore Tez Johnson at this point on the board. There are certainly limitations within his game, but I mean, let's be blunt here. He's going to be a Denver Bronco in the fourth round, and he's going to catch 100 passes from Bo Nix because he's his brother, and that's just how it's going to work. And so that's he's going to end up pretty good. But I think that's a good point on this group of players here, because I do think that these are talented receivers. This couple of runs that we've gone through here, and we are going to be watching these landing spots, and that's going to allow some of these players to emerge.
And I will say Kyle Williams is a guy that you kind of put me on. I hadn't even watched him yet until you told me to, and I'm not even going to get into the scouting jargon and the advanced analytics or anything like that. When you watch this guy, he just plays with like the swagger of a wide receiver one, and maybe
He's a
that's
dude.
just what was that?
He's a dude.
Yeah, that might just be too blunt and boring of analysis, but go watch Kyle Williams, and he just plays like he is ready. Like you said, Jeff, he is a dude. Wide receiver 18 and wide receiver 19, back over to me. I'm going to go with Nick Nash and Ricky White here. Nick Nash is a guy that I really like. We also talked about him earlier in the week on the show when we discussed guys to watch in the combine. I'm going to be watching closely to see if Nick Nash, some of the traits that I saw at San Jose, translate to the combine this week. So a player that I'm really excited about to see where he could potentially land. And then Ricky White is a guy, Jeff, that you and I have talked about a little bit. Great athlete, had over 1,000 yards in his senior year. So much of what he does is just kind of catching the ball on slants and ripping off big plays after the catch. We'll see if that can translate to the NFL level. We'll see if an NFL team likes that trait enough to take a chance on him. But Ricky White cannot deny the athleticism. So he's a fun player to pick here. And back over to you for wide receiver 20 and 21.
I'm seeing a pattern that I just realized that kind of walks through these picks. You're kind of on these small school guys that had pretty good production. My picks end up being these 5-star guys that were in the SEC, and like
Jeff,
that's kind of like
this might blow your mind, Jeff, but I spend a lot of time in spreadsheets.
yeah, noted spreadsheet dude, Dave
Yep.
Kluge. But yeah, it's and I'm certainly well
He's a
well
dude.
traveled SEC supporter apparently. But Ja'Cory Brooks, he was a 5-star recruit when he was at Alabama. He had a little bit of a window. Things kind of fell apart a little bit. Landed at Louisville. Had a really good strong year this year with Tyler Show this year in Louisville, and that's my pick there. And then Arian Smith is another one of my darlings that I'm expecting a big rise out of the draft. He had another guy that had a strong Senior Bowl. And yeah, it turns out that Jeff likes guys that had strong Senior Bowls and that are good athletes and have blue chip pedigrees.
Well, Jeff, I'm going to throw you for a loop here with the next two picks that I'm going to make. Pat Bryant out of Illinois. You know, he's a perimeter guy that could develop. I think the athleticism is there, the size is there, very developmental prospect that can grow into, potentially a very good wide receiver. But what are your thoughts on Savion Williams? This is a guy that you and I have not talked about at all out of TCU. I mean, you look at this guy, pulling it off the top of my head, I want to say he's like 6'5", 240. That sounds about right. If not, somewhere around there. I mean, this was a former high school quarterback that we saw used as a wildcat quarterback. We saw him at fullback. We saw him at halfback. We saw him at inline tight end. We saw him out wide. We kind of saw him doing everything at TCU. When you see a guy with that level of size and athleticism, they usually draw a little bit more buzz than Savion Williams has. Jeff, I'm just putting you on the spot here. What are your thoughts on Savion Williams?
I think that he's not Quentin Johnston, and
Yeah.
people take that however they want. But I mean, I am a noted Quentin Johnston supporter, so
Mm-hmm.
you can take that however you want too. It's one that the athletic tools are certainly there, but probably the uniform that he's wearing probably has a little bit more blowback on him than he maybe deserves at this point. I mean, we saw playing the same offense as Jack Besh and Jack going and stepping forward as that primary receiver there. It's a big part of that. Just kind of one of these that it's really tough at this point. It is pretty hard to bet on these big toolsy receivers figuring it out because you go back. I mean, you're a Bears fan, Dave. Kevin White throwing
Mm-hmm.
back some way
Yep.
back
Yep.
machine thoughts there on these players that we bet on because they don't make them like them, but then they don't really work out very often.
Just hear me out. Savion Williams drafted to Pittsburgh to play with Arthur Smith. Tell me you couldn't get behind it.
Well, I'm sure that
Maybe.
he would do a lot with those 2 targets a game that Arthur Smith would allow him to have. That, and meanwhile, blocking for Cam Hayward and whatever
All
else
right,
they want to do.
we've spent way too much time talking about Savion Williams. Let's go to your next two picks, Jeff. Wide receiver 24, wide receiver 25. Who are you taking?
Yeah, Keandre Lambert Smith is a player that, again, a high pedigree. He was at Penn State. He was the primary receiver in that offense. I mean, they probably could have used him this past year because none of their receivers could catch the ball after he left, went to Auburn. And he's a player that when you watch him at Auburn, he really was able to expand his game. He went from being kind of a short target, underneath target, kind of in the Jahan Dotson mold a little bit with Penn State, following in Jahan Dotson's footsteps, to being a vertical player at Auburn and making plays downfield. And I think he's really slept on in the process. I think he's just a player that can do a lot of different things, and he fits well within a receiving rotation. And then Isaac Tesla is just a bet on athleticism. I think it was Hillsborough College that he was at. Is a very, very small school in Michigan. It's actually, I don't think, very far from our good friend Corey Spalla. That I think it's in kind of Kalamazoo type area. So he was a quarterback, and then he is just a freak athlete. He was at Arkansas, and he was a kind of a under the radar player. But what Isaac Tesla was able to do was he climbed the attention. And why I'm always looking for, so there's the Tropical Bowl and the Hula Bowl, and those
Mhm.
kind of start things out, and then there's a kind of feeder bowls into the Shrine Bowl and the Senior Bowl. And Isaac Tesla was a player that grew and got another invitation and was able to get into one of those bigger bowls.
Yeah, he is definitely somebody worth watching, a name who has been pulling some steam over the last couple of weeks here. I'm going to two more picks for me, and then you can finish it off here. Wide receiver 26 and wide receiver 27. I'm going with Kyron Lacey, who is a fun player out of LSU. Just played the last 2 years at LSU after transferring from Louisiana Lafayette. Grew as a prospect, still a developmental guy, but definitely has some traits that could turn him into something at the next level. But the next guy that I picked here at this turn, Jimmy Horn, I really like. And of course, Travis Hunter is the guy out of Colorado that got all of the buzz. But Jimmy Horn, if you watch him, clearly just the fastest guy on that Colorado offense, played primarily out of the slot, would occasionally make a play downfield or a big play on special teams. An undersized guy, but I don't get scared off by these undersized guys quite as much as I used to. 5'9", about 170 pounds soaking wet, but you can't teach the speed that he's got. I mean, he might go out there and run a 4.3 this week, and if he does that, he can solidify a draft pick for himself. So a guy that's a little bit undersized, but I think he could get drafted as a special teamer and has the ability to grow into a slot player in the NFL. Jeff, bring us home. Can't wait for you to talk about this guy.
Well, first, LeJontay Wester is my favorite Colorado receiver. Shout out to
Right.
my guys with all 22. They turned me on to him from Florida Atlantic, and then played this past year in Colorado. And then Kyron Lacey does have a messy legal situation that we're kind of waiting to see what happens there. So,
Yeah.
my Mr. Irrelevant, the most relevant Mr. Irrelevant, Afton Chisholm. You just pencil him in, ink him in as the Josh McDaniels slot for Drake May and the guy that's going to catch 120 balls for the Patriots, Afton Chisholm, from Eastern Washington, noted receiver hotbed, Eastern Washington. Chisholm was a player that he could have gone to a bigger school, but he grew up in the area. Cooper Kupp was a star at Eastern Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Kendrick Bourne was a player at Eastern Washington. They have the red turf. So if the red turf is Eastern Washington, where Afton Chisholm is from, and again, a player that could have gone to Idaho or even bigger school than that, and he stayed home at Eastern Washington, and he made a big impact. And he's a fun player. And he profiles very, very well to what the Patriots have usually looked for in the Josh McDaniel offensive tree.
I don't know if I told you this, Jeff. When you told me about Efton Kism over a month ago, first thing I did obviously was Google his name, and the first result that came up was a Reddit page on the New England Patriots subreddit that said, "I just got finished watching film on Efton Kism, and I don't care what they have to do. Reach for him in round one, take him in round two. We need this guy on our team." So you think he'd be a great fit for the Patriots, and Patriots fans are already right there in lockstep with you. Well, there we go, Jeff. Nice and quick. We were able to run through 28 wide receivers. Who else do you know that's doing that in less than 20 minutes? Giving you a brief little rundown on every guy you need to know in this upcoming class. Jeff, we're going to keep doing this next week and the week after and the week after as we get closer and closer to the NFL draft. Anything you'd like to say to the audience before we sign off today?
Kyle Williams is a dude.
Kyle Williams is a dude. And on that note, I want to thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week.